Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 34. The Italian peninsula is divided by a branching spine of mountains that parcels the land up into its old kingdoms and cities. The Bosporan invasion was proceeding down the eastern coast, and their goal, Rome, is close to the western coast. But one cannot simply take an army from one coast to the other without traversing many passes and being confronted by many cities. In this way, the Romans had seen extensive defeats in close proximity to their capital over and over throughout their history, yet always it seemed that a battle in one pocket of the region did not quickly achieve anything in the adjacent pockets. It was this same phenomenon that allowed Rome to gradually defeat all other cities on the peninsula without any group of them arranging an attack on Rome. I preface my description of the Bosporan advance with this geographical context because you might question why I am about to tell you that it took 5 months for Zeusis and Phocas to lead the Gold Guard only 2,000 stadies, perhaps a few days on horseback if one is not overly rushed. The reason is that the number of cities, passes and fortified checkpoints that existed on the route was large. Fortunately, they were not well manned, because the Romans expended their best men in the action I have already described. The Bosporan army crept south at a very relaxed pace, because segments of the force were always dispersing to find towns and small cities in need of prompting for surrender. Only one city did not yield when the Bosporans arrived, and it was Ariminum. This was, like Altinum, a major trading centre supping on the traffic of the Adriatic, and it was considered the principal Roman city of northern Italia, discounting Mediolanum, a larger and more northerly but far less Roman city according to those from the south. Perhaps they were right, as the city remained defiantly neutral in the current invasion. A full 2 months were spent preparing to storm Ariminum. Here, the Roman habit of patronizing carpenters and engineers brought the Bosporans a boon. The territory conquered so far was wealthy with military engineers, whom the Romans employed day to day to drain roadways and prepare forts with unbelievable speed. This was actually done not by the particular talent of these men, but instead by the sheer number of them Rome tended to employ. Because they were unusually intelligent and practical men, they had no reservations when it came to serving Darus. Hence, catapults and ballistae became as common as trees around Ariminum, and resultantly trees as common as two-headed horses. The city had been so greedy that it had spilled out of its walls in the preceding decades, providing shelter and ammunition to the turncoats for 20 days, during which time the walls were systematically dismantled from a distance. Prince Phocas led his men to the wall and saw that there were hardly any Roman soldiers, and the townspeople were practically begging for mercy. Striking upon a novel idea, he did not enter the city at first, instead calling for negotiations to be held outside the walls. The city sent representatives eager to avoid a sacking, which they overly feared because of Roman lies about such things occurring in other cities. During the talks, Phocas had his engineers clear a neat path into a chosen breach in the wall, and then promptly built the sides and roof required to make it appear like a fully fledged gatehouse. Then, he had the delegation join him in heading inside the city via this new gate, and of course they were astounded to learn that their city had a new gatehouse. But Phocas made everyone halt outside it so he could call up wagons from his camp laden with Eastern textiles and bronze fixtures. With these he decorated the gatehouse until he finally was able to declare it fit for the leading men of the city to use. Only then did he allow them inside, taking applause from those willing to come out of their homes and see the procession. Peace was signed without delay, and if you visit Ariminum today, you'll find they have maintained that makeshift gatehouse and added countless new decorations and sacred oaths to its walls. That is all there is to say of Ariminum. With the city pacified by the end of summer, the march on Rome began in earnest. As I have implied, no more cities wished to offer resistance, and so now the march went smoothly. In fact, Ariminum was the terminus of a wide road, so wide that 2 wagons or chariots could pass by each other without alteration of course, that went through the shallow mountain pass to the south and on towards Rome. Phocas took the lead in marching upon this road. Zeusis and Darus moved slowly behind, taking surrenders and transitioning territory into the Bosporan fold systematically. All 3 armies were overwhelmed by appeals from slaves to rescue their brethren from all manner of places, although not always was this rescue synonymous with liberation. for there was much that Zeusis in particular wished to achieve when it came to laborious projects in the region. Yet I shall spare you this, for the culmination of all of it is what need interest us. Rome at the time, and for decades afterwards also, was the largest city in the world. It possessed walls which served not to protect the city, but delineate its most important core, nestled within so much other urban development that it was as if there was another city in every direction beyond the city gates. But it was all one city whose aura of superiority is undeniable. This was the product of 1 million people's wealth being brought to one place, coin by coin. Although most of the people living there were poor themselves, because simply being close at hand to the Romans means your coin was easiest to take. However, over the centuries, an assortment of legal protections had brought the Roman citizenry to a place of safety from overly foul treatment, and all Romans are proud of this. We should not look down on them for discovering through accident and arrogance what our ancestors knew from the very beginning. The point I wish to make is that you will hear much of how the Roman people violently resisted the coming of the Gold Guard. This is like a dog barking at someone because its master was doing the same. There was no grand battle and not even a closing of the gates when the Bosporans came, because all who might bear even the slightest responsibility for the city's crimes had already fled. It was mere street violence and desperate expression of regretful loyalty to absent masters that constituted the struggle of the great city's fall, an end more pitiful than most nameless villages or mist-veiled outer sea redoubts. The loss of life was, in a darkly Roman spirit, absolutely wasted, and if the Roman theory that deceased spirits cannot return to the earth is true, it is in cases like these where the world might be justified in rejecting its children, with the exception of the Bosporan lives given to quell the fury of this twice defeated people, once in allowing themselves to be ruled by tyrants, and again in having those tyrants expunged. Let this dour topic not distract from the achievement I am relaying. Rome, the keystone of an empire with half the world in chains, was taken. There was not a Roman living or dead who had imagined this would be the outcome of their sanctimonious warmongering, and across the world there were people throwing back their heads in joyous laughter to hear that the dreadful city had been humbled so convincingly. The Roman Empire was like a stool whose legs had suddenly disappeared. There was only one thing that could happen now, whether the one sitting upon it noticed or not. I do not claim that this was the total defeat of the empire, because the Roman government had already been moved away. This was the luxury they were given by the slow approach of the Bosporans. I think, though, that as the people of the warring empires endured the winter, there was no doubt that everything about the fate of the earth would be different by winter next. This would not be a repeat of the grand war that befell the Golden Age. It was a neat and masterful war that honoured the ways of gold, an exercise in corrective violence that defies all the usual bemoaning of the wages of conflict. Prince Phocas received Prince Zeusis and King Darus in the large temple which the Romans called the Curia, a temple to Rome itself rather than its patron gods, which may reassure some. In ordinary circumstances, councils of several hundred would sit in a large chamber surrounding a rostra, and from there they would mandate the lives of all peoples. Indeed, it is often said that in their furious rejection of the natural notion of kingship, Rome traded one for 500 kings, and I can assure you that when a citizen receives dire tidings from their masters, it matters not to them whether one hand penned the writ or 1,000. Equal were the Romans in their powerlessness, for all the power was made available to the chosen few. And where were those few at this most important time? They had fled south, where more than one new senate was made to harbour them. But there were not many people willing to listen to them without their armies. Other leading men of the city came to the Curia, but fewer than 20 people were bold enough to sit and receive the formal embassy of the conquerors. Seeing this, Darus had the city scoured for any men of minor note who spoke Greek, so that they could hear his words and pass them on to their compatriots later. Once the Curia was full, and battle-scarred shields made sturdy compulsion to stay, the king took to the rostra, the first true king to do so in almost 500 years. He delivered these lines: "It does not take a philosopher to notice how this chamber bulges with men of talent, but how many talents more are there within a shout's hearing outside these walls? Ordinarily, those who line these benches would say that my question matters not, for we are full up inside here. One cannot consider improvements from without before we are emptied of those unworthy within. Such is the way your noble senators encourage you to see this entire world. You and all people are going to learn in the days to come that joyous news that so many have already been blessed to rediscover, that our world is limitless. It is here for us. It is not limited by the being of true descendants of Manos and Yimo, not at all weighed down by the silent reverence of the gods who made these lands before all other gods, and no, not at all at risk of toppling over under the weight of endless souls. But after 3,000 years of chaos, we have become something different to what we were. We have listened to the gods, and they have bickered over our fate without halt, muddling us towards happiness and sadness in uncountable strands. Now every man has their own idea of good and evil. Everyone listens to their patron gods, and many of you do something more foolish. You listen to men who are not kings. I say kings in the ancient sense, those set apart from humanity in order to lead them, and in turn not permitted humanity of their own. That is how I see it. A king sacrifices everything for others. There is no privilege to it. It is simply to our merit as an animal of the world to be organized and ordered, and that is a labor of the mind from which good men recoil, for it is poison to us to be made apart from all others through power. A king wishes not that kingship had burdened them. A king, as you understand it, a half-man king, makes others wish he was not a burden to them, for the poison takes him and asks him to be ruinous upon others, to gamble at happiness returning for fleeting moments, never to be secured. This is the most important difference, and more you shall learn, because you are like lands denied water by a great floodgate. We open the gates now to let flow the truth that bathed my father, Pyrrhosides III Spartacid, once king of the first lands, and I do believe, within the veil of the oldest places, king still. The stones of the original population of this world still exist, and upon them are sly engravings of all knowledge that we need. This was their gift. This is still their gift now. From these we know our world is troubled by mighty forces that are difficult for us to control, yet not impossible to control, and indeed were once in perfect order in the time of the Golden Age. That time, friends of mankind, is both in our past and our future. You are not Romans conquered by Bosporans, or by Greeks, or by Scythian barbarians. You are none of these things. You are half men, that is the term. You will come to know what that means, and how to be different. And when you are whole, you will see Roman and Bosporan as childish fantasies dreamed up by the old masters of you and I, who sought to treat their poisons of the mind through our suffering. It is not Rome I conquer, but this foul obligation of doom. It is the reins of human history that I seize, and I ask you to seize it with me. And I know that when you see the truth of our world, I shall not even have to ask you. I welcome you all, forever citizens of what they call this Bosporan Empire, and I call for every toast and cheer to be done in the name of a golden age, for all mankind, for us. I do not know if many people listening to this were convinced of the sincerity of the king's speech. Certainly it was an influential enough oration to have been transcribed immediately, because the earliest Latin versions you can find are from the very same day the Gold Games began. This was the 10-day festival Darus held to give pageantry to the scions of gold and relief to the common people, said to have been announced for immediate effect in the same session of the Curia as the above speech was delivered. And when we must speak of Roman resistance to Bosporan government, it was not the Roman Romans who caused any trouble, but instead those on the frontier. Ariminum arrested and threw out their Bosporan governor 3 times before Zeusis arrived and pacified the north. It may be that because Rome itself was already entrained to the cosmic fate of the world, albeit with mistaken interpretations, that they were more easily converted to support the noble cause. That is part of the reason why these final blows of the war came so swiftly, for resistance seemed to be broken. The Roman people and Socii alike were overawed, and their leaders were in full flight. Let us speak of 146 prior, when the result of all I claim comes out in detail. the Bosporans in Italia concerned themselves with conquering the remaining cities whose gates were not formally open to the new masters of Rome, of which there were perhaps 3 or 4. Most notable was Neapolis, the location of the bulk of the Roman Senate at the time. They took to the sea and went to the large island known as Sicilia, where other Roman forces were beginning to muster too, a sign of life amid the ruins of Roman power. In the south, the Ptolemies were now marching with Dion and company in their vanguard, capturing the hook of the coast that leads to Carthage proper, another place the Romans were trying to regroup. These conquests were hardly contested. Dion was able to take personal dominion of a port named Sabatan, which was to become like a new Carthage, sharing the relationship old Carthage had with its mother city Tyre, and Hierosolima added to the parentage for an even surer bevy of mercantile support. In fact, this work began before the war was over, as Dion's men were expended by the long trek across a large amount of the world, and an inhospitable stretch at that. Still, to Rome, all they saw was their border being rolled up, their dictator killed, and if this pained them to see, it was a dire thing that they could hardly look away from the south, for to look north was to abandon all hope entirely. I write not only of Italia but of Gallia now too, for in 146 the princes Aristippus and Cneius had begun unravelling the Roman strongholds in the quiet Dead Lands. After almost a year of careful mapping of these ravaged places, they were able to bring the strength of Germania under their new union to trap the Romans behind their walls, whereupon death was the only permitted exit. And all the lands which were abandoned by the living could now be walked upon again in security. Aristippus declared that these lands be made available to all heroes who fought back against the Roman Empire, wherever they might hail from, inspiring endless unrest among Roman captive peoples. Now all the world was throwing stones against the stumbling giant. Illyria was overrun by Thracians, Adricians, Getae, and then Luthosis, when the king quit Italia to come cut off those escaping across the Adriatic. City after city was taken, and Roman banners tens of thousands of stadies apart were falling on the same days. The last hope to steal a breath above the waterline came from an auxiliary legion of hillmen and Ligurians, hailing from the lands straddling Italia and Gallia. They had remained undetected and uncommitted in the prior invasion, and suddenly reared their heads in Italia to begin a march on Rome of their own. The soldiers firmly believed that the man named Praetor Bibiculus, who led them, was to be the next dictator of Rome, and hence to flatter his ambition was to have a chance at unbounded rewards. Perhaps that explains why they did not turn on their oppressors, as other peoples of Europe were doing. What reason they had is hard to discern, for their fate was so violent that no scrap of written intent could have survived. Here is what happened. Bibiculus did as the Romans usually do, and built a walled camp every day. This protected his men from attack, but one more in tune with the spirit of the scenario will see that really this is done to make it very hard for soldiers to leave camp unnoticed. Thus, trapped by their employers, the men were extremely vulnerable when Zeusis and a band of picked men wheeled catapults into position in the dead of night. As usual, the Romans had no outriders, for now anyone who owned a horse had long since used it to flee Roman service. This allowed Zeusis to establish himself within range of the camp on open ground unchallenged. Only when the catapults began to launch hot oils and burning bushels did the alarm sound, and the fires bursting to life in the camp lit up the shadowy Bosporan shield line fronting their fleet of machines. The Roman camp was engulfed by heat and smoke, and men abandoned their posts even as officers stabbed and chopped at their comrades for doing the same. Those who made it outside were assailed by invisible arrows, for Zeusis had deployed the unit his grandfather, Spartacus, had always favoured, Cimmerian hunters, whose speed and aim were unmatched, and now were impossible to discern from the grasses waving in the hot winds as they pierced the panicked. Then the few hundred gold guard let the catapults lie and charged with swords aloft, driving all Romans nearby back into the camp and to their demise. Others did escape this deadly night, including Bibiculus himself. They fled onto a nearby mountain. However, they were overtaken quickly by Zeusis' better drilled footmen, and the hillsides were fertilized with these slaves of evil. The vitality of the earth and of Rome are like two sides of a scale, one rises by another's fall, and that is how the last Roman army in Italia so fruitfully fell. Some will call this the final battle of the war. I do not consider it a battle any more than the bloody siege of Rome's Temple of Saturn was a battle. It was mere euthanasia of those too poisoned to be saved, and there was nothing martial or valorous about the action involved. But you may call it what you wish, because people waste too much time on these issues of categorization these days. In tandem with Zeus's campaign, Phocas took the main army southwards to receive the submission of the cities there. He steered eastwards in order to reach the metropolis of Darus, a Greek city which had been cruelly forced to supply ships for the Roman invasions of Greece in preceding centuries. With Phocas's arrival, the same prospect was to re-emerge, only now the Romans would be servants and liberators of Greece. Yes, the very thing they had deceitfully claimed to be in their prior intercessions. See the plentiful works on the fall of Greece for the full serving of Roman roguery. However, an invasion of this kind was not to prove necessary, in the same way that one needn't push a cart that is rolling downhill. I shall elaborate on this shortly. The year 146 was drawing to a close, and I would like to cover the final bounty of ill tidings that the highest men of Rome were made to quaff. This came from Gallia, where the thinly stretched Roman order was shattering beneath the weight of not only Bosporan armies, but all of Germania. In particular, there was a remarkable battle that took place on the grey shore of the Outer Sea, in a place called Belhi, which is where you can sometimes witness the presence of the dark island of Albia. Here, an army of the Cimbri, the bitter enemies of the Golden Age coalition so recently, marched beside the southerners under Prince Aristippus to flush away two frontier legions at once. The much larger allied force chased the Romans to the sea, and there it is said that as the sea lapped the shore, the two legions were cleansed between the crashing of waves, as helpless as a piece of driftwood in the shadow of Poseidon's foot. The Cimbri had motivations aside from service here. They were to profit from inheriting lands that were superior to their own in productiveness, and now almost devoid of inhabitants to provide trouble or competition. However, Aristippus was, in turn, not allowing this out of generosity, because trouble and competition were what he feared here, not from the vanquished Gallians, but from the warlike Albians. There is much said about the Albians these days, and a sizable number of people claim that they are actively working to dislodge humanity's foothold on the climb to the cosmos. I find, though, that many people think of the Albians as being like they were in the time when Aristippus was taken by these same fears. It is true that in those times, the war which had started 3,000 years ago was still being fought, which is why the island grew from its humble beginnings near the coast of the world to being so large that modern expeditions have shown it to be comparable to Gallia now. And hence it was correct to fear those people, who anyone living along the coast would tell you are well prepared for war and practice it from birth to death, and equally were known to occasionally sail to the mainland to extract some privileged treaty arrangement. The Gallians bought metals from Albia, since they are generated there continuously by the island's wars. There is too much to say on this topic, therefore I will tell you only that some hundreds of tribes of Albia entered agreements to carry on trading with the mainland, in exchange for that ever-present Bosporan clause, free passage of scions of gold men. Truly the Albians cannot have understood what this group was, and that might be fortunate for us all. This brings me back to the above point, that being how Albia today is, if not compliant wholly, calm. I should like to visit it, however there is limited time remaining to do a survey of the depth I would like, and so I shall leave this work to others, perhaps yourself. You shall have the golden age to spend on such things, of course, so please keep in mind that academic work will become an ideal pastime. Once a peaceful border was established, and a warlike people left there to ensure it remained as such, the Bosporan armies were to turn into the interior of Gallia and capture one of the few inhabited places the Romans maintained for the purposes of wintering. This proceeded smoothly, and by winter's end, Aristippus and Cneus would be in possession of joyous news, so give me the pleasure now of relaying that news from its source. The close of winter 146 brought a message to Apollon, to where King Darus had returned after carefully arranging changes in government in Illyria, such that the people, who were not very friendly with the Getae, did not feel overly that Apollon had become their ruler. They did not yet understand the merit of this. This message was authored by one Consul Traianus, who had come to chair the largest extant part of the scattered Roman Senate. They were based rather close at the port of Dyrrhachium. This is what Greeks now called the once famous city of Epidamnos, after the Romans conquered the Epirot people. Now this diminished yet still wealthy city was host to what must be considered the seat of the Roman Empire, nestled anxiously now in that often campaigned through region which adjoins Greece and Illyria. Arising to the intent of this message, King Darus summoned a large entourage from as many different peoples as he could recruit in Apollon. This included almost the entire academic host of youngsters, as they hailed from across most of the world, a fact obvious by casting a glance across their varied faces and garbs. He procured wagons of food and wine, and sent forward runners to have all places on the road to Dyrrhachium, be they large or small, prepare a festival for the day of his arrival to each. When asked which gods the festivities should be dedicated to, Darus replied, "To those that are your allies, and to spite those that are your enemies." Already the king was looking to the negotiations that would take place when his business with the Romans was over, the appeasement of the cosmic gods at the close of their reign. After the liberal spreading around of money and cheer, King Darus arrived with an even larger band of supporters that might easily have been mistaken for an army. Not stooping to claim they were a threat, Traianus invited a portion inside, and went against the will of his senators by allowing for a parade to be held in the city at the king's expense, which was outrageously brash, yet indicative of the material superiority the king enjoyed in this parley. I think Traianus probably intended for it to be he seen as the benefactor of this, but everyone knew the truth. I have not said it plainly so far, so allow me to leave nothing uncertain. Traianus had called this meeting for peace. Admittedly, he was not so badly beaten that the word surrender might be used. It was rather a very harsh peace that was predicated on freezing the war in place, since otherwise the Romans were set to lose more and more. In turn, the king was both happy to avoid further conflict and privately aware that the Roman army and navy was busily regrouping on Cilicia, outside of Bosporan reach for the time being. The Bosporans had only a handful of captured ships, as the Romans had carefully moved all craft to safe harbours. Therefore, the peace treaty can be simply put as, any place the Bosporans had captured on the day of the peace was to remain Bosporan. In this way, Gallia, Libya and Illyria were indisputably dismembered from Roman power, to say nothing of Italia. The Romans were permitted to keep colonies in the southwest of the peninsula, and it is often said that this is more insulting than taking the whole landmass from them, because a starving man is worst served by standing in the door of a bakery forever serving others. It will suffice for analysis that all of the monetary centres and stores of wealth the empire had mustered were now in Bosporan custodianship, to quote the writing of the treaty. For now, the Romans must have thought in addendum. However, they had executed a devastating misstep in thinking a period of peace would benefit them. It is easy enough to explain. The Roman state, to describe it in the abstract, had been scattered across different territories, along with the men who carried the power of this state. This caused the effect that the provisional capital at Dyrrhachium was not in good command of other would-be capitals, such as New Carthage, Syracuse, or even Athens. All of these places had their own men eager to take the reins of day-to-day business, and some also had men who might brand themselves with the cause of Roman restoration to make the remains of the so-called Republic into their personal kingdoms, a moral path the dictators of Rome had burned clear over decades of civic decline. Furthermore, the legitimate wielders of power in the legal sense were the senators, and they were whizzing about the inner sea with animalistic madness. To net these prizes, Darus sent an edict to Prince Phocas to be enacted in Rome itself, whereby the properties and land of high-ranking officials of the enemy were to be transferred over to the state, with exceptions made if the land appeared to be productively employed by the owner. Hearing of this measure, 200 senators crept back into their luxurious homes and estates in order to plead their case before Phocas's bailiffs. The pleas were always accepted in order to lure in more and more nobles. This was not a trap with any particular purpose in mind, and in effect these men became private citizens of the Bosporan Empire by the same precedent that made even slaves partially enfranchised by merely living under Bosporan law. Importantly, a huge amount of wealthy and experienced elites were rendered unavailable in places where military uprising and active pursuing of war were the agency of the Roman remnant. In turn, with no practical government power, the people were not enthusiastic about pursuing this course. Overall then, the Roman gambit of peace was to tear them apart and grant hope to its most rebellious subjects, while others ensconced the spirit of peace so deeply that the rippling mirage of leadership had no chance of persuading folk to enter the worldwide struggle the rhetoricians continuously squawked over. This was all to become clear in the years after the treaty. The peace, in truth, preceded periods of violence for both sides. King Darus began the grand task of organising a new and just order to rule over his new territory, and found that the people did not want his justice but their own. That is to say, they wished for freedom. But that was a fearful concept with so many lies abound. The king needed to ensure that the truths of our world, handed down not only from his father but from the father of all people, were accurately relayed and understood by every single person. Of course, if you have no method to convince people to heed your words, you'll never get a chance to have those words be the method of convincing. And so it was, regretfully, a time when every ambitious man of Italia made a nuisance of themselves and drove thousands to their death in hopeless uprisings. It was Italia specifically where this happened, as elsewhere the funds to raise armies that were at all likely to overcome the Bosporans' might could never be collected by a single conspiracy. The king boldly forced these obstacles aside and established the High Temple of Rome, in which the Scions of Gold could aid the needs of the people and instruct others on how to do the same. Original runestones were brought for display, and some of them are still there now, as most on the scholarly circuit will have witnessed in person. And eager treasure hunters burgled their way through Rome's private collections to find the stones Rome had procured over the previous 6 decades, of which there were very many. I shall return to this. There are conflicting reports on the early successes of the Scions of Gold. On the one hand, the Romans were somewhat versed in the sacrosanct nature of Golden Age lore, since their previous masters had been using this righteous attitude to leverage good people into horrid crimes. In particular, the notion that our actions on Earth can affect matters of the cosmic, and the fate of our compartment of reality, had been spread far and wide, easing the transition into the Golden Age notion that paragonic behaviour was the actual conduit whereby humans can approach our boundary with the gods. This gives some credence to the idea that the Romans were enthusiastic learners and then practitioners of the purest cultural norms, which is what is commonly said. This stands in opposition to the fact that we have clear record of political firestorms in Italia from as recently as 40 years ago. Certainly a pacification and education that lasts 100 years cannot be said to be quick. At least one would prefer that those who took on the good work of understanding the cosmic order would see the promised returns within their lifetime. Yet to those watching from beyond the celestial sphere, 100 years must seem like a sudden moment in which humanity's course was changed more than they imagined possible. Alas, the gods cannot ever imagine the true potential of this world that is further and further from being theirs, as always was its design. To ground ourselves in real evidence, consider this. The success of the Scions of Gold in taming a certain amount of the fallen Roman Empire must have been great enough that it became known to the Roman vestige, because of what happened in 142 prior. On the first day of the year, the nearest thing to representatives that the Roman state in exile could field were sent again to Dyrrhachium for the Conference of the First Peoples. This festival-turned-citywide symposium was originally designed as a celebration of the specific ways of living developed by our ancestors, in order to help establish modern equivalents that could bring everybody in line with the founding principles of the world. It was to be held in Epilogue, but the expression of interest from Roman parties prompted Darus to kindly move all activity to the de facto Roman capital. Of course, Romans were those he wished to hear his message the most, so call this not a shunning of his loyal people. One might even argue that the rise of Greek administrators across the Roman world hardly left room for Dyrrachium to be considered an enemy city, as those more inclined to war liked to do in those years. The most impactful outcome of the event is the one you have already learned about in histories of modern affairs, because it is always lauded as the first event that occurred in the so-called modern age. I shall leave this status unchallenged and take the cautious approach of telling you what I am alluding to, at risk of patronizing studious readers. The Romans invited the Scions of Gold to come to any place that might have them under Roman dominion. This was no surrender or even an alliance, yet it was something that would have been common to both had they been achieved through some larger, more terrible war. It was a plea for aid. It was evidence, I contend, that the Scions of Gold had become extremely influential over the people the Roman Empire had lost, even only 4 years after the war's end. You see, what territories the Romans had were a squalling mess for the reasons given already, and all attempts to re-establish a state atop this foundation had failed. With troops and money expended, those still clinging to legal authority had turned to a wild and cynical option: to employ those pacifying Bosporan territories for themselves. And with so many new priests and scholars of worldly wisdoms coming about in those years, additional employment was welcome news, and kindling for further waves of professional educators. There is confusion to be had here, because what was being taught in Rome as the original state of mankind was not the same as what you would learn in Chariskos at the time, and nor did Chariskos provide the same tales as Hecatompelos or Hierosolyma or Casurgis. I could go on. This is because it was not always specific aspects of Golden Age culture that mattered, and the Lithosis themselves left such things open to interpretation. After all, the paragon deities are examples that each person must use like utensils, whether the meal before them be known, unknown, or ever-changing. So I do not agree that this was a weakness of the collective Scions of Gold movement, or agree with those who say that Darius and Aristippus should have collated the world more closely to their will when the fires of fresh wisdom burned the hottest. What is worthy of discussion is how the understanding of the cosmic order was changed by the capture of all the ancient runestones that the Romans had hoarded. As per usual, their collection, drawn from all over Italia, but principally Rome itself, was awash with duplicates, forgeries, and stones that appeared completely blank. Over the years, the set was examined and transported to and fro across the world, so that foremost experts might seek clues to their authenticity. And of course, the runes themselves were translated into Greek, and onto all languages required from there. The true aspect eventually extracted from this promising dirt was one I have alluded to already: the fact that the phenomenon of human death has a relationship to the interplay of the world and the gods. More illuminating was a claim stemming back to the Golden Age itself, in which one writer was concerned that the gods would become more powerful as time went by. In the Golden Age, everyone's death was being treated with proper reverence, and hence their energy returned fully to the world and swelled it, creating new lands and new waters. Over time, the volume created caused the world to, in effect, grow closer to the cosmic sphere. Imagine a water skin growing larger as it is filled, such that its surface gets closer to you even if the mass as a whole is unmoving. This writer was truly insightful. The power of the gods was indeed growing during the Golden Age, until the time came that their whispers began to undo and overwrite mankind's happiness with new needs and desires, confused desires in service to the bodiless voices all heard, and indeed the words spoken by the faithful of Manos became too quiet or sometimes impossible to perceive. Such is the sensitivity of perfect order, and such is the carelessness, or indeed the malice, of the gods. With light and dark, human and earth, no longer in accordance with original design, the growth of the world was wrinkled, and the wars that came stopped creating fertile lands and instead brought about the icy and barren mountains found in all regions today. And ever since those days, 3,000 years ago, this problem has steadily become more onerous. It is with endless joy, then, that you and I live in a time when the reversal of our wayward course is nigh. One trembles to think of it. I will not detail the full philosophical history at hand here, but know that this seizure of Roman knowledge and distillation of what was true marks the creation of the foundation of the paragonic method which so much now depends on. That we have so many paragon deities today is in part because of these discoveries, or rediscoveries, and also in part the achievement of good people and good gods. I have some personal thoughts on this that are not strictly relevant to this work, so I will relegate them to my afterwords. With all this said, I find I have reached the end of my remit in covering the pre-modern period. The state of the world was perilous, and the tribulations that my colleagues write of in the century to follow are so numerous that I am sportingly mocked for the fact that my own work consists of so few pages in comparison. Yet we know ultimately that the worst way forward for humanity had already been happily passed by once the Bosporans and the Spartakids finished making themselves hegemons of our world. In a period of some 80 years, a withering band of frontier colonists had gone from a string of disasters under so-called Emperor Hyaenon to the steady taming of the steppes and first lands under King Spartacus, to the stunning revelations and conquests under King Parysades III, to the responsible and professional defeat come salvation of even the most formidable enemies that King Darus brought about. And this is to say nothing of all the endless achievements of the Lithosis peoples of the Deepwoods, whose long vigil over ancient knowledge has rewarded beyond measure, and whose skepticism and hatred for the fallen half-men that plagued them was at last reversed by the proof of redemption the Bosporans provided. There was much the knowledge keepers of Deus and Dagon needed to learn from the war-born world they hid from, and now we are all so much richer for it. Who does not know the story of Manos, Ymo, Taurus, and the founding belief that a world must exist apart from the endless cosmos? A world where thinking beings do not understand the meaning of war, of the thrashing of light and dark from before the beginning until after the end. Everyone knows that this world is not all there is, but it is all we should ever want. And I do believe that with all I have written in this volume, you will be able to connect the spread of this wonderful knowledge with the more basal rise of the Bosporan government, and indeed with the heroic and fascinating campaigns those early leaders achieved in our name. Well then, I will now let the tale be taken up by other works. I must, however, conclude two matters: the fates of the principal heroes we have journeyed with, and the lines which connect this Morrow of the Golden Age to my own contribution due on the Day of Reckoning. Thus, permit me this epilogue before you open the next volume. Epilogue. I shall begin with King Darus. Being a man of firm principle, he did not take particularly well to the realities of empire. He is said to have expressed frustration at the difficulty of taming his people, and I think this frustration itself was doubled and redoubled over and over when he realized that his inability to embrace compassion for his people was a debilitating weakness for a king. Not for a standard king, mark you, but for a king of golden pretension, anger towards one's own people was grounds for dismissal under the old ways. Those ways had not yet returned, yet we cannot say that Darus did not progress that course. Under his stewardship, the Scions of Gold were arrested away from the most potent and tempting poison the gods were offering them, money. In their position, acquiring copious monies and their resulting power was not difficult. However, Darus insisted upon teachers among the Scions of Gold being rigorously tested for their character, and almost always made to donate their personal property to the state before any official rank was given. This was the beginning of the long transition he wished to pass down as the new Spartacid legacy, a transition from rulers exerting power to rulers exercising power that others made flow through the monarchs. I use monarchs in the Lithosis sense here. This we shall see when I speak of Aesop. The king perished of a cruel illness in 129 prior, supposedly contracted from being in the close presence of sailors on his many journeys across the inner sea. That others around him did not seem to contract any like illness can be taken as demarcation of Darus's curse of kingship, and a sign that the bond between power and sacrifice was mending. This is what those who study historical patterns have determined. Prince Dion carried on acting as a state-sanctioned despot in the places he had taken dominion over. He was the foremost champion of sacrificial rites, and mandated that all people who died within his reach be contributed to one of his public altars. These altars, confusingly, were rarely altars of the type found in temples, instead being grand parks in which the dead were buried at shallow depths so that their energies of death would be reflected into energies of life by the boundary of earth and air. That is the theory of it, and I have found those who have studied this to the point of being satisfied that it has at least some effect. Yet it was very different to the treatment of death that our ancestors practiced, and likely hardly as useful. Still, since Dion was too politically expensive to rein in, he carried on, boasting of how many slaves he had, and becoming rather too interested in certain Ptolemaic romantic traditions. He was not well suited to his prestigious rank among the Spartakids. His end came when he spontaneously departed with a caravan to travel across the Great Desert. He wrote he'd met people from the southern outer sea, which is ludicrous, so I suppose he wished to go and witness this fantasy for himself. From 132 prior then, Dion's estates were parcelled by the state and proper rule of law was at last established, although great famines and plagues seemed to affect those places at the same time, so it was not a very happy period for those being uplifted. Whether this sort of thing undoes the astounding military work Dion contributed to the pacification of the world, I shall let others decide for themselves. Prince Phocas, son of the king, yet not of the inheriting line, maintained a largely ceremonial role as the Grand Commander of the Gold Guard. His victories in the Italian War were already enough to carry his name, so while he did not accompany his men on most of their ventures, he remained renowned as a military leader. His primary achievement became the promotion of the Gold Guard as forces for good, creating lavish pageants in their honour all over Italia. It was Phocas who established many traditional parades and mock battle competitions, and certainly he inspired many others to carry on the practice across the empire. He retired to Chariskos in 103 prior, and entered the woodland vales of secrecy thereafter. Prince Zeuxis, son of Dion, spent much of his life as a military man serving in the west. He is noted for shunning the use of Gold Guard soldiers, because he did not trust them. His reasoning was that they no longer had any rivals on the battlefields of the world, and hence their power was too dangerous. I can see merit in this, even if nothing ill actually came of this threat, barring the famous Balearic incident. Zeuxis spent his later years in Persia, which was a very fashionable thing to do even then. He was known for his mixing and matching of different styles of armour he'd collected from all over the world, combining them sometimes for practical effect, and other times for the effect on his appearance. This was the sort of thing that is and remains very popular in Persia. In my judgment, he became too enamoured with the scene he built around himself, and his many battlefield glories were too easily forgotten, since he hardly ever discussed them. One suspects that he underwent a change during his service, or was taken by the power of another. Yet he did not become a paragon like Aeneas upon his death by ill health in 119 prior. Prince Aristippus is next, and I only mention him so late because he was the nexus to the crown's future, and I say let the future concern us last of all. He extended his good record in curtailing the wildness of the Hermanians for many years, and took his acumen west to see that the renewed lands in Gallia were brought swiftly into the embrace of civilization. Of course, most important was his crowning as king in 128 prior, after the brief rule of witness period muddled the matters after Darius' death. Aristippus produced a mixed reign of very short wars against pretenders of all kinds in all places. From his chronicles, a delightful read despite the often dreadful subject matter, he can be assessed as a dedicated yet exhausted ruler, who dutifully convinced others to adopt the philosophy of giving perfect kings their due respect, while being well aware that he was not such a king himself. This is the view that he endowed as a powerful legacy to his second son Aesop, contributing to Aesop's own most important legacy, which I shall lay out shortly. Aristippus was regrettably lost to us under vulgar circumstance. There are so many differing accounts that I can hardly discern anything resembling history from the murk, so I will say that the only bearing common among them was that Aristippus told the wrong joke to the wrong person, and in doing so stirred up such feral and animalistic candour that the murderer did his business in front of a hall of onlookers, and indeed in front of guards who delivered immediate justice, but to trade the king's life for that of a miscreant is a harrowing justice indeed. Thus did his reign suddenly end in 111 prior, and Prince Cineas leapt into his place. Cineas was a rather different sort of king, because he was, of all the Spartakids, the least Greek. I refer to his manner rather than his heritage, to be clear. He is one of the only Bosporan nobles to have ever gone into the deep woods by special permission of its residents. After the Roman war was settled, he carried on the greatest share of his livelihood along the borders of the World's End forest. Recall he was married to a Lithosis noble of ghostly visage but grand repute among her peers. Her influence and connections brought him closer to the ancients than most. His prayers were thus seeped in references to hardly known heroes of old, would-be paragons from the time after the paragon deities lost their hold over mankind. This was key, for his interest fueled the conversion of many old temples and shrines into more relevant spaces for today's reality, in which paragon deities are rightfully worshipped in the only way that they ever wished, observation and emulation of their worldly deeds. This began in the cities close to the deep woods, and crept outwards by virtue of Cineas personally funding temple conversions, and striking up such powerful rapport with priests of all kinds that hardly anyone felt they were being put upon by accommodating requests that many called sacrilegious. After the death of Darius, he doubled his efforts in this regard, being no longer an enterprising prince, but the heir to all he saw, and hence he wished not only to see it all before he took charge of it, but shape everything around himself so that a greater harmony would one day be achieved under his stewardship. This, of course, was a wiser way of carrying out princely duties than many of his successors would ever achieve, and we were too slow to identify this behaviour as the height of honour. Now such things are commonplace, and indeed mandatory for those concerned with ruling, yet in those times to take care to prepare oneself for the throne was considered a waste of time by even high philosophers, who would often posit that good rule by men was too impossible to pursue in a single human lifetime. How limiting that view must have been. In 111 prior, Cineas was thrust onto the throne, and sat upon it with the utmost composure and grace. Being aware of his father's method of demise, he kept his guards close and his tone jovial, which in some cases made angry audiences all the more angry, for indeed a king should not be happy. Over time, Cineas dove so deeply into his work that happiness must have been rightly purged, although he wrote little and said little of his experience, so we are left to guess upon it. Such was his intention, one must assume. His duties allowed him to return to the deep woods only once, on the foul business of dealing with the Albion incursion of 102. A confederation of island peoples sacked Duna and began to make the forests their own, driven mad by the rumours of hidden cities and hidden riches. Alas, there were hidden warriors too, and Cineas brought ample might to see that all those who came to our shores were submitted to said shores in sacrifice soon after. While a counter-invasion of Albia was organised, it was never carried out because the islanders understood their position to be weak, and furthermore had gradually come to understand how they were benefiting from their supposed enemy's ascendancy. You see, by that time it had become well known that the world was warming up, and snows in the north were less disruptive than in prior centuries. These things were universal evidence of rejuvenation, and reward for lives lived well and sacrifices made at the correct times, with the correct souls, and via the correct procedure. The core curriculum of the Scions of Gold educational regimes, and the only part that could not vary across the world because they were based on the indisputable instructions given to the very first people to live in this place. Because of all of this, Cineas reigned on in peace, internal disruptions aside, until an equally peaceful death in 95 prior. Then came King Aesop, with whom I shall conclude. While not as privileged with Lithosis' blessings as his elder brother, his time as prince was spent learning everything he could of what the Golden Age was really like. It is said that no one on Earth knew more about it than him, although it is said too that if this was really the case, he did not act especially different for it, let alone pass on useful knowledge to others in the way one would expect. But for, of course, his major contribution to the world in 89 prior, the banning of automatic titles. Yes, the very reason he was called prince before was the same thing he banned, and so his children were not called princes and could not be presumed to become king in the future. In ancient times you will find measures like this being taken, so those who say it was a revolutionary measure are being hyperbolic. However, it was rare indeed, and rarer still in a case where the throne commanded power over so much of the world that its occupant might well do anything they pleased and get away with it. It was this spirit, that is, the corrupting influence of the position, that Aesop was able to shun, and that is the truly revolutionary part of this achievement. His full history is overshadowed by his edict on the search for true kings. It was interpreted at first as a declaration of his desire to adopt a son and name them heir, breaking Spartacid tradition yet still aligning with the practices of previous generations, in line with the role of witnesses of the king being de facto adoptees of the dynasty's rights. It became clear that it was really intended to be a stronger form of this concept, in which a chosen ruler would not be adopted as heir to the Spartacid line, but established as a so-called dynasty of one, and rule for their allotted time under obligation to select another ruler to follow them in like form. This was the beginning of the master and squire system which ensures order today, and will do so even more effectively once our transition is complete. And it was the end of the Spartacid dynasty, whose story is tied so closely to the story of mankind's recent history that they are one and the same, making it all the more remarkable that it suddenly ends. Those cynical among you will note that Spartacid men still rule today here and there, but this was only because they were well placed to take on such roles. Were you truly a more wise and worldly leader in your heart, you would be made to shine with irresistible brightness to those whose legacy depends on the selection of a fine replacement. And I would not wish such glories upon you, for the strain of it bends people in ways that no friend can enjoy the sight of. Yet I digress. To finish, Aesop retired himself in 77 prior and was granted access to the Deepwood as reward. As always, his fate after that point remains his own secret, equal in sanctity to any Lithosis secret, so let there be no more said of it. From there, truly this tale falls to others, even those alive today might tell you most of it, and hence my remit, even in its extended form, is undeniably through. Therefore, let me provide some parting words. My life has been spent in scholarship with a particular purpose, and I would have you know that purpose is paragonic. I am among the privileged who were singled out in 43 prior for having great potential. At the time I was easily convinced of this, being quite young, and hence I was set on a path to attempt a new form of paragonism not known to be possible, that of the honest chronicler, the perfect chronicler, so novel because in the previous Golden Age, chronicling was only practiced in dire emergencies, hence the runestones and little else emerges as their literary record, even though there was so much more to their culture. My method of achieving this was to commit myself entirely to my work. For 20 years I travelled the world and collected evidence and tales to cover my chosen study with unsurpassed detail and accuracy. Ever since my return to Chariskos, I have carried on that research as I wrote, forever changing the record for the better and taking on board the sage advice of many callers and interested parties, whose insight was always a delightful surprise. Is this the pinnacle of scholarship? It shall be for the world itself to decide when the exodus of the paragons is upon us. It is a worry to think I might have failed in my task, however it would be a worry greater still to think that I had not attempted it. Besides, by the year of the Exodus I shall be 71 years old, so it shall not be right to say I am throwing my life away. For my method of death I have chosen suffocation, because I wish to pay homage to a rumour I've yet to confirm regarding the nature of breath. In Alexandria there is a group who have interpreted certain oral traditions in a novel way. They have found that a certain phrase, often translated to mean death, is more accurately interpreted as not breathing, and does not imply death in all circumstances. There are passages of some runestones that make more sense if this interpretation is allowed. So it may well be that one part of the recipe for human perfection in the Golden Age was to learn to do without one's breath. Obviously, for those of us born in darker times, we are completely beholden to the sustenance of the air. Yet I was so intrigued by this old notion that I thought I might see, on the off chance, whether I might demonstrate my paragonic life through an attempt to live on without breath. Should I succeed, it would be a marvel. Should I fail, then my true purpose would be completed all the same, for I would, or should, begin my journey to the cosmic sphere on the final day. In the horrid circumstance that I simply die, and do not produce a spirit that approaches the cosmos, even then I will take heart, as should all of you who have not been privileged with the sponsorship to become a paragon, because to die properly and return to the earth is a right reserved for humans, a power no god can ever possess. To exercise that power, and renew our enclave with your strength, is an honour beyond honour. Indeed, to be a paragon, like a king, is to forego humanity and all its boons. That is not to say I dread the day of sacrifice. I shall give myself as gladly as any of my peers, that we all might go together to the cosmic sphere as motes of light and dark entwined, half cosmic, half real, and join those who came so far before us in the battle against the cosmos. I had best hope there is need for truth and scholarship in this business. After all, human wars benefit from such things, and human wars are the product of cosmic malice first and foremost. Let it all be shut away, the stars forever extinguished, first by the smoke of sacrifice, driven by the wind of the whole world in song, then by the efforts of our new pantheon. When you look up at the sky in 7 years' time, you will see the shield as black as pitch encasing you wholly, and you will know that the paragons of our age who gave their lives to the sky have turned the tide. Light and dark, the core forces that built the gods, will have at last become something entirely new, something entirely perfect. Mankind and mankind's world will be locked forever into its second golden age, safe at last. When I think on this, I am thieved of all apprehensions for our future. But we did not come here to hunger for the future. For now, we remain students of the past. Each page brings us successes and failures that we, as a people, might emulate and avoid on our path to perfection. Let these chronicles of war and circumstance ring in your ears, so that when the glories of the future come, you will not be like the half-men. You will know precisely how your life was made, and hence what you are to make of it for the sake of others. History carries the purpose of our world. That is what the daring Prince Pyrasades discovered all those pages ago. If all I have done was of worth, then mayhap I have imparted a similar joy unto you. Now go, with Darus and Dagon beside you, and reap good tidings for the golden morrow.